Okay, so we're going to start off here, and we're going to talk about ace and king high boards. But the most important thing to take away from this video is the way that we are spreading out those bluffs I talked about in the last video. Now, we have 7 bluff types, okay? Now, I know we normally start with our value bets, and we'll talk about those a little bit as well. I think that those are kind of clear. Generally speaking, we bet value bets on the flop. We look to go 3 streets with them. Generally speaking, if we cannot go 3 streets, we generally go for a flop check. Some hands, like good second pairs or weak top pairs, we can put into a bet flop check turn called river, so we can have some bet check bets. And you know, I think the value bets are going to be fairly straightforward, so I'm not really going to waste that much time going through that. But what I really want to talk about is how we're going to piece together all of these bluffs into our strategy. So just to take through these 7 types of, I guess we're going to call them 7 types of small blind bluffs. So C-bet and give up. These hands generally have backdoor equity or even flopped equity, and they brick the turn, and then we have a lot of other hands that we can pick for bluffs. Now, let me give you a couple examples of spots, like kind of like the normal hands. The normal hands would be a hand like, let's say that on a board like King Jack 5, the 5 was a club, and we had 6-4 clubs. Okay, so we have a lot of turns we can get. We turn a flush draw, turn a straight draw. That would be a very classic bet and then give up on turns and rivers that we don't improve on. Bet check are hands where we have equity in the flop, have equity on turn, but on the river we're not a really big fan of our hand to select as a bluff. Generally speaking, I like flush draws in this. Maybe some of the lowest flush draws can also be good bluffs, but you really want to avoid barreling 3 times when you have a flush draw, because now the chances that your opponent has one have gone down. So this is generally flush draws. Bet are hands that have equity on the flop and the turn. And the river, they're one of the better hands as far as removal goes. I, generally speaking, like using the straight draws in these spots on boards that brick out. And on boards where the flush gets there, I tend to like using straight draws with one of the suit of the flush. I think those end up making the most sense. But there's also going to be a lot of boards, you know, when we look at all of these different types of betting the flop and then having to, you know, make decisions on the turn of the river, there's going to be a lot of looking at the board and making some estimates. Like, you can't look at a board like ace, ace, queen and then be like, okay, I'm going to use this way of looking at it, because if you do that, you're not going to have enough bluffs. So sometimes there are going to be boards where you're going to have to just use non-equity to go 3, and you're going to have to use some non-equity to go 2. And generally on the flop, I don't think you almost ever have to go non-equity. I think you can mainly just pick either backdoor draws, backdoor straight draws, backdoor flush draws. I mean, if you talk about something like a backdoor straight draw on ace, ace, queen, hands like 3-2 qualify. There's a lot of hands there. So generally speaking, the flop should always have some backdoor equity. The turn will mainly have equity, but on some very dry boards, you might want to pick some bluffs. You're going to look to triple barrel a bunch. And on the river, you want to think about all of the hands you bet the turn and bluff with half of them. And that's, I guess, kind of it. Like, when you bet the flop with a bluff and you're on the turn, you want to try and bluff with about half-ish of the hands that you bet the flop with that bluff flop. So think about all your hands. Do I have to use some non-equity? And then sometimes it might even be the opposite. Sometimes you might have to give up with hands that have equity. Boards like that could be on a board like 10, 8, 6, where you have lots of hands that can have, you know, one card to a straight, flush draw, overcards. You know, there's a lot of hands there that can have bluffs. Sometimes you have to pick hands that aren't good enough to bluff, right? Sometimes it's the other way. But you have to think about all of your hands that bet the flop. How many of them still have equity? How many should I bet? Now, as more hands do have equity, you can bluff more in poker because you're more likely to improve on the river to hands that can bet for value. So, for example, on a board like ace, ace, queen, turn 6, you have to use less bluffs than on a board like 10, 8, 6, turn 4. Because on that board, there's way more rivers you can hit. You have more equity against their call range than you do on such a static board texture. Maybe that's a good rule just to note down that on static boards, you have to bluff less on every street because you have less equity when you do bluff. Now, and by the way, that's another reason why the dynamic boards are generally better for the in-position player. Now, you're going to have to get used to thinking about things like that, and we're going to go through and look at a bunch of these different boards, but all of these types of bluffs, you need to get very familiar with that process, very familiar with figuring out your value combos, and then figuring out how many bluffs you get to have by the river. Bet check bet is certainly the weirdest type of bluff, I would say. Generally speaking, if you bet the flop and check the turn and your opponent checks during the river, you're going to want to bet check bet with hands that were very, very low in showdown value. So an example of that, if we can maybe find one out of the gate here, I can't see one that immediately makes sense to me. But maybe, you know, let's say you have a hand where you open up 4-2 of clubs and the flop is king jack 6 with the 6 of clubs, and you decide to bet the flop. They call, and then the turn to 10, check, check. That's the kind of hand you want to bet in the river. You want to take your absolute worst hands that you can have that bet the flop, that then check the turn, that have the least showdown on the river. Now, this is kind of a classic poker debate. Should you pick hands based around their removal, or should you pick hands based around their showdown value? The answer to that is, of course, a blend. And the answer, furthermore than that, the answer matters around how important the removal is. But I will say, if it comes down to a point where it's like, do I want to have the right amount of bluffs, or do I want to have the right exact hands to bluff? I'm always in favor of the right amount of hands, because we are people and we're going to make mistakes on which hand will be better. We're going to sometimes misunderstand removal. And sometimes we might think that there's a lot of hands that have favorable removal for us. So rather than picking in all the spots the hand that has more favorable removal, if it's difficult or you're having a hard time getting the right amount of combinations, I would just try and be efficient with what you pick. That's why on these boards, when I'm looking at bet check bet lines, I'm generally picking hands that are the worst showdown value, even though you might make an argue for some other hands that have better removal. Because if I do that, if I only use some of the worst hands I'm betting on the flop and checking the turn, then I'm not going to be over bluffing. I'm going to be picking the right amount of hands. Furthermore, bet check bet is a line I use less than a lot of players, because generally speaking, I look to bet hands on the flop that can go 3. So the way that I play it is, occasionally when I turn very strong hands, I check. Occasionally I bet top pairs planning on checking the turn. Very occasionally I bet some of my best second pairs planning on checking the turn. And then sometimes I bet and then check with hands that increased in strength on the turn, and I'm looking to play my river range accordingly. You're always going to have some value in the bet check bet with that combination of value bets, betting and checking the turn. However, that's not many hands, because most of your value bets that bet the flop are going to continue to bet here on the turn. So you have to be very careful with selecting your hands that want to bet the flop, check the turn, and bet the river. For that reason, I like picking the hands that I know are some of my worst possible hands that I can have, because I'm not going to be over bluffing, and it's going to end up being 20 or 30 combinations of the lowest hands. I would recommend doing that. If you're very good at efficiently picking out combos and picking out 20 or 30 combos of hands with the best removal, that's probably a superior strategy. But if you start going overboard in the bluffs, it can lead to a place where your opponent can start bluffing you a lot by check raising. They can start calling you super light, and it can put you in tough spots. So I would generally prefer to pick an efficient way of bluffing over a maximally optimal, from a removal standpoint, way of bluffing. But I'm also going to leave the ball kind of in your court there on how you think you can get it done. The check back bluffs are generally more simple because there's less lines. But if we check back and bet turn, both of these hands tend to be queen high, jack high hands that don't have as much showdown value where I'd want to check them all the way down, but they can improve to good pairs. And that's something that I noticed kind of out of the gate. Weak king highs, queen high hands, jack high hands. If I do check them back and use them as a delay c-bet bluff, whenever they pair that top card, that's always a hand that can value bet the river. So they work kind of nice. You might get your opponent to fold a better king high, a better queen high, a better jack high. When you hit that pair, it's almost always good, because if they had top pair, they're probably going to probe the turn. And then how I look at it on the river is, my higher hands I check because they have a bit of showdown. Not much, but a bit. And my lower hands I barrel because they have less showdown. So maybe on like a board like a7-3, a hand like queen 8 would be a nice delay and check, whereas a hand like jack 8 will be a nice delay and barrel. And again, you're going to have a bunch of value in these spots. You're going to have weak top pairs, you're going to have second pairs, you're going to have hands like queens. You're going to have a lot of value, I would say more so than even the bet check bet line. So you can work in combinations. But here's the thing. When you look at hands like all queen X, you have 16 combos of every queen X if you open 100% pre. So if you use queen 3, queen 4, queen 5, queen 6, queen 8, you're already at a lot of combos, and your total amount of value in this range might only be 100 combinations. So you're going to want to base it around how much does my opponent fold? Generally speaking, if you're playing a strong opponent, your king highs are going to have to just check all the way down, because if you try and bluff them, you're going to over bluff. Your queen highs can generally delay c-bet. Your jack highs can generally delay in barrel. Now, the boards change things a lot. There's a lot more to take into consideration than that. How much you're opening, how much they're folding, the size you're going to use, the range of value bets you're going to represent. But those are the kinds of hands that we're looking to check back and bet turn, bet river. And I see kind of out of the gate here, we have a 10-7 hand that could make definitely a reasonable flop bet. I decided to check back and turn a flush draw and bet on this queen. This is going to be a clear hand that bets turn, bets river because of its showdown value, whereas a hand like Jack 8 of clubs, for example, might be a check after betting the turn. Or if I decide to bet a hand like King 3 or King 4, it's going to check after betting the turn. So you're going to be betting the lower ones and bet checking the higher ones. Check, check, bet is the simplest range of hands to think about. It is the worst non-equity hands. If you open and you have 7-3 off and the board is ace, queen, 9, that's a great hand to check down and bet the river. Now, I will say on some of the high boards, you're going to have to use some hands that are non-equity because you don't have enough hands. And on the paired boards, you're going to have to use some as well, particularly on the disconnected ones like 9-9-4. But in general, if you have no equity and very bad showdown, you're looking at checking down to the river and bet, because if you check down the river and fold to a bet, they probably had you beat even with their bluffs. And if you check it down to the river and bet and they fold, these are your most efficient bluffs. These are almost never good in that spot. They're almost never good. So when you bet and they fold, it's an extremely efficient bluff. These are a little bit less efficient. When you bet a hand like a weak king high or a queen high and you get a fold, a lot of times you're ahead to begin with, but you do deny some equity and you put some of their hands in a tough spot and it balances that out. I haven't found a better way that I thought made more sense than these hands here, but I think that's the best way of approaching it. So we're actually going to title this video a little bit differently. We're going to talk about the 7 types of single raise pot bluffs. And the next video, we're going to jump in and talk about some hand selection across some different board textures. Sorry, ace and king high board textures.